While the world was waiting for the highly anticipated Nikkor Z 35mm f1.2s, the Nikkor Z 35mm f1.4 was a surprise full-frame non-S-line release when it launched in July of 2024 for a suggested retail price of $599.95. It has 9 rounded aperture blades that range from f1.4 wide open to f16 stopped all the way down, and not being an S-line lens, has no special coatings on its 11 elements and 9 groups, 2 of which are aspherical. It has a minimum focus distance of 0.27 meters, that's 0.89 feet, and its 74.5 by 86.5 or 3 by 3.5 inch body weighs in at 415 grams or 14.7 ounces. So what do we think? Right off the bat, it's kind of hefty for its size, I'd say. Construction-wise, it's mostly plastic, but there is a very tiny ring of metal up here on the top. The focus ring is pretty smooth. It can be done with one finger. Off camera, I have tested this on every single camera I have, and it's got a decent balance on all of them. The Z8 and the Z9, obviously, a little back heavy, but it feels really, really good. It's got a good length to it, and so it fits really good with all of the cameras. The Z9, not really so much because you got that bottom grip there. That kind of hits, but it's a pretty good kind of form factor. What used to be an aperture ring, which is now a programmable ring that I turn off because I bump it all the time, it's a little bit stiff on this particular copy. I don't know if that is typical. This is a rental, after all. We have a metal lens mount. That's good. As far as the feel, it kind of feels like every other Nikon Z lens. No disappointments, just exactly what I would expect. Not much else to say first impression-wise of the Nikkor Z 35mm f1.4 non-S-line lens. And I think probably the next thing we should do is go and do some test shots. All right, so I'm out in the yard with the Nikkor Z 35mm f1.4, and I'm excited about this one because you guys know I wasn't real impressed with the f1.8s. It's totally fine. It's an acceptable lens. I think it's a little bit overpriced based on just how it performs, and I want to see how this performs compared to that. Now, this is not an S-line lens, and so I don't expect it to be optically as good, right? And it's not really that much more expensive. So as far as tests go, this is the kind of stuff I like the most because there's a real there's some things to consider if you're in the market for a 35mm. Me personally, I'm still holding out for the f1.2. So I wouldn't own this lens personally, but it may be a really good option. So I've shot the 35 f1.8s a long time ago. It already has a score on zwadephoto.com/theopticexplorer. But we're going to get into this right now. The first test I've got to do is focus speed test. So let's get our Atomos going here. Okay, so going from infinity, it is pretty slow. Let's get on something a little bit closer, I think. And going not from infinity, just regular focusing speed is pretty slow too, but so is the 35mm f1.8s. And so if you're looking for focus speed, save you a little bit of money, I guess. All right, now I got to do focus noise. You can hear it whirring a little bit. I don't know if you'll hear it on mic, but I can hear it. It's not super loud. Maybe wouldn't be a problem if you were going to use it for video, but in my head, I don't know that it's much different from the 35 f1.8s. I don't really care about focus noise because I don't shoot anything that, I don't think they're ever that distracting anyway. But it's just something to think about. It does have some noise, right? It's not super crazy. Get over it. Point I'm getting at, so far we're 2 for 2 on why pay more for the f1.8s. So now we need to do the focus distance test. So let's put this over here and see what this looks like. I will say as a side note, form factor, I kind of like on the Z8. It feels good on the Z8. About right there is the minimum. So that's pretty good. That's pretty cool. You can get some good shots with that. And now I got to shoot off one real quick for the black and white ability. Now I've got to do my saturation shots, but I will say looking through the viewfinder, and you know, my picture profile is set in neutral. I'm seeing neutral. It looks a little dull.
But that's not that surprising either, because I thought the 35 f1.8s was a little flat too. I thought it was flat rendering. I thought it was a little bit dull, but I think it does have better contrast than the 35mm f1.4. Now, that may not be a buying argument for you in choosing which one you want to do, but for me personally, I'm always after like as close to like optical awesome juiciness as I can possibly get. And so for me, it matters. But for you, you can literally add contrast in Lightroom. Or if you're using Luminar, which if you want to check out Luminar, there's a link in the description. They're an affiliate of the channel. You can add contrast, and then they have super contrast, and so you can get real stupid with contrast. But just to note, yeah, just like looking through it, it just looks a little dull as far as like the colors go. Normally I shoot red first, and our target today is this red lantern. So we're just gonna shoot that real quick. The reds look all right. We're gonna shoot this real quick for the yellow. All right, yellow. Yellow. Yellows seem kind of just like okay. We got this kind of like neutral, dull kind of blue. So that'll actually be okay. Blues look very, very accurate, like spot on. And then looking across the yard, again, I already mentioned the greens, but we'll just kind of shoot this. And the last thing I gotta do is find the sweet spot of this lens. I don't do this with every lens. I don't generally do it with zoom lenses, but with prime lenses, I like finding the sweet spot, which is a really boring shot of the tree. So I'm gonna do that real quick. Something interesting I noticed, and I was just shooting the bark of this tree over here. Through the viewfinder, it seems to be pretty weak in contrast, like I was mentioning earlier, but there seems to be, and we'll see in Lightroom, but there seems to be a significant increase in like the quality of how the lens looks when you hit about f2.8. And so it's kind of dull, kind of dull, kind of dull, and then boom, it kind of starts to pop at f2.8. Now that's not uncommon. Generally, your performance of like an f1.8 or even like an f1.2, the more you stop down, the more you're gonna get those kind of nice juicy qualities, right? But it's a little more kind of surprising, I guess. Like usually it's just kind of like, yeah, it looks a little better at f2.8. It looks significantly better at f2.8 through the viewfinder. Now we can hop into Lightroom and take a look at these images.
So I've got the images for the Nikkor Z 35mm f1.4 here in Lightroom, and you may be asking yourself right off the bat, hey Zach, why is this one so underexposed? Well, this one here isn't. The reason I did this is because first of all, I think just about every lens benefits from being underexposed a little bit. I just like the color and the contrast that you get from underexposing a little and bringing it up a little bit. The 35mm f1.8s, which I'm not a huge fan of, especially at its price. I just didn't think it was that good. That lens I found to be very, very flat rendering, but when it's shot a little bit underexposed, it is a lot better. So I just took two of basically the exact same thing, and we're gonna take this one and we're gonna bring it up to about where this one is. That's pretty close, and it's apparent here. This lens is actually, I don't think, as flat rendering as the 35 f1.8, which is surprising, but of course it is even better whenever it's slightly underexposed. The color is just better. The contrast is just better. I'd say the bokeh looks pretty good on this. And it's not as sharp as the 35mm f1.8s, but it's not incredibly less sharp. Let's get in on the one that was kind of properly exposed. See if we got some fringing on the screws here. A little bit of purple fringing. We've got some fringing around there as well. Definitely fringes more than the f1.8s. You might expect it to. Get down to the out of focus areas. Touch of green fringe right there, I think. It's not offensive though. Let's look at some saturation. The reds look really good. Let's look at yellows. Yellows look really good. The blue is kind of more on the natural side. It's got a little more saturation than natural. And the greens are pretty normal looking. All right, so I did a little sweet spot test here. This is at f1.4. Let's not get in at 200 though. This lens at f1.4 kind of reminds me of the sharpness that you would expect back in the f-mount days whenever any lens was wide open. With the Z lenses, generally you have great sharpness, even wide open. And this is just kind of reminiscent of, you know, the F-mount days, which aren't that long ago, but, you know, Nikon's optics have advanced since then. You got one at f1.8. This is even better. This is quite nice, actually. f2.5 seems pretty similar in sharpness. Whoa, Zach underexposed much? This is f2.8. Looks pretty similar. This looks pretty similar too at f4. Actually, f5.6 looks like it's starting to lose sharpness, which is not good. Generally, you don't see the effects of diffraction until later on. But 6.3 looks about the same. 7.1 looks about the same. And f9 looks about the same. So f5.6 looks like when it starts to lose sharpness, which is kind of terrible. That's kind of a terrible quality. Thought maybe it was just motion or something, but f6.3 and 7.1 all look the same, all the way up to like f9. They look pretty similar. So that leaves me with no other thought other than you start to get diffraction at f5.6. That's kind of gnarly, actually. Oh snap, almost forgot to do black and white ability. Let's just hit B and W. It is pretty flat. Not a whole lot of wide range of tones. Let's do Gravedigger. Oh. Wow, even Gravedigger isn't as strong, and Gravedigger is always like really strong. Okay, black and white ability is on the lower end.
Sure, doing the test shots are fun for me and interesting to some people, but nothing really compares to actually getting out and doing some shots. And so let's go do that.
All right, so we did a little walk around here, and this is really similar to a shot that I remember with the 35mm f1.8s, but this is the 35mm f1.4s, shot at f1.4, 1/4000th of a second, 64 ISO. It's not overly sharp. Focusing down here in this particular image. I think I ended up doing this one in black and white with the 35mm f1. That fringing is out of this world. That is wicked fringing. Holy shit. And the trees and everything. I mean, this is like the most extreme scenario, like blasted white clouds, you know, with a thin object here. But this is probably pretty close to, if not the worst in the Nikon Z lineup. This is the scenario where you expect fringing. Anyway, I think I did this one originally in black and white. Let's look at Gravedigger. Of course, Gravedigger looks cool. We got a little flower here. The saturation's kind of okay. Doesn't look too bad. It's kind of natural. Give this a little play here. The bokeh is nice and creamy though. And if we want to take this thing and just make it look like it isn't, I'd say Black Tar Heroic is nice and cool. And Bonjour Beige is pretty sweet. You want to pick up any of these presets and see what they look like, you can go to zwadephoto.com/digital products. I like this image. It's not overly sharp. This lens is not overly sharp. I'd say it's probably just sharp enough. The one thing that the 35mm 1.8s has going for it is that it is decently sharp. It focuses at the speed of smell. And me personally, the things I use 35s for, I need it to be a little quicker than that. It's a very realistic rendering lens out in the wild when we're not testing specific colors. It's very kind of true to life. I like kids aren't all right if we like pull down the exposure. Oh yeah, I was excited to see what these look like because this is kind of like some of the weird shallow depth of field stuff that I like so much. So at f1.4, it reminds you of the F-mount days. It's not particularly sharp. I think it's probably better to shoot this in f1.8 if you're not specifically needing 1.4. It's exactly like the F-mount days. Now this is extreme scenario, green fringing, purple fringing, of course. There's nothing special built into the optics of this lens like there is on the S-line lenses that help control some of these things. I'm thinking so far that I think that this 35 is a little overpriced as well. it does have some niceness to it. Like the softness at f1.4, like we got back in the f-mount days, it does give a little bit of a softness and kind of like a dreaminess that most of the other Z lenses are not going to give you. And so it's less clinical than a lot of the Z mount lenses. And if that's your thing, if that's kind of what you're into, then this might be a good lens for you. I would just pick it up used, I think. I wouldn't pick it up new because I don't think it's worth what they're charging new. Just based on its optical performance, you know, just what it's doing in today's day and age. I think that this really, based on how it performs with its focus speed and how the images look, I really think that this is like in the ballpark of like the 28mm or the 40mm f2. The 40mm f2 might actually be a better lens than this, and it's half the price. And for whatever reason, my preset Whoa Beige Betty, Whoa Beige Betty, Babylon, kind of looks like it was taken on film, and that's kind of cool. Looking in here, yeah, it's got that kind of look. I never really cared for that look until that look was not a thing anymore because we have clinical sharpness wide open these days. And now that I'm looking at it, I can kind of see like a market for people that want this kind of thing, because it is kind of dreamy. You might ask yourself, oh, Zach, why are you shooting at f1.4? Well, pretty much every lens is going to be sharp at f2.8, right? Like, if you have f1.4 and I'm testing it, I'm going to test it at f1.4. I already tested, like, diffraction. I wasn't real darn impressed with that, so. Blue Mood Portrait looks cool. I'll just, like, leave that. Maybe a little vignette. There we go. Did this one at f5.6 just real quick. A little kind of careless shot. And, it's okay. It's just not overly sharp in any sense. Just kind of sharp enough. And I popped into the local brewery. Took this real quick. This is kind of close to minimum focus, right? This is like getting pretty close. Yeah, it looks okay. Habanero looks cool. Kind of some goofiness going on with this bokeh ball here. Gravedigger takes this underexposed shot and makes it kind of wicked. It's a okay lens. It's pretty okay. I have to say that since I think the 35mm f1.8 S-line lens is overpriced still to this day, this comes in at just $100 cheaper-ish, $100-ish cheaper, because this lens is inherently not as good in any kind of measure as the 1.8 S-line lens, and it shouldn't be. S-line has all that stuff that kind of helps with the fringing and things like that. It's not as good as that lens, and so this, by default, is also overpriced. Should you get this lens over the f1.8S, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. Do you want the sharpest lens that you can get in 35mm? If the answer is yes, then the f1.8. Don't worry about the aperture at that point, because the difference between f1.4 and f1.8 is basically nothing, okay? It's very, very small. But if you're looking for something with kind of a look, the 35mm f1.8, while sharper with better contrast, it is very much a clinical rendering lens. This lens at f1.4, as I mentioned in the image review, it does have a particular look. That look didn't used to be a look. That look was just what you got back not too long ago when you shot pretty much any lens wide open. It just wasn't that sharp wide open. That's a rather new experience that we're having. Modern Nikon Z mount lenses are sharp whenever they're wide open. This reminds you of the F-mount days. Now, in the F-mount days, I never really shot anything wide open because I wanted more sharpness than that. But I mentioned in the image review, now that that is gone, I sometimes kind of miss a little bit of softness because it does give a little bit of a dreamy look, even though it's not technically good necessarily. So if you're not looking for clinical sharpness and you're looking for something a little more unique, then this would be the option. So to wrap it up, 35mm f1.8 S-line lens, still overpriced. So this is by default also a little overpriced. And also, if you want a technically better lens that's sharper, wide open, you get the most sharpness at your widest aperture, get the 1.8S for only $100 more. But if you want something a little more unique, and I might even argue more fun, get the 35mm f1.4. But do not buy this just because it's $100 cheaper, and do not buy this just because it's f1.4 versus 1.8. There are much more important things than f1.4 versus 1.8. I'm Z Wade, the Z Wade, and Z Wade Photo. Stay sharp, YouTube.